So in the last lecture, I talked about the duty to obey the law, and we went through Socrates' arguments that there is some kind of duty to obey the law. So in this lecture, I want to talk about what we do, or what is it's acceptable to do when we think the law is unjust. So I think there are a few things to say. One, if we do think there's a duty to obey the law, if we are convinced by some of these arguments, that duty is only going to hold for certain states. So one of the things to notice from the Crito is that Socrates thinks that Athens is, on the whole, a pretty just state. Now, if a state isn't just, well, it comes in degrees, right? And we'll talk in a second about what the reaction to states that are unjust, but maybe not thoroughly bad. But I think it's worth saying a little bit about states that are thoroughly bad to start with. And, by a state that's thoroughly bad, I mean one that's just horribly unjust. Nazi Germany, for example, or North Korea. And what philosophers tend to agree is that there's no duty to obey the unjust laws of a state that's fundamentally unjust. The average German had absolutely no duty to turn in Jews to the Gestapo. The average North Korean has no duty to rat out his neighbors if they're doing something against the state, or to stay in that state because the state says it would be wrong to, say, go to South Korea if he could. But what do we do about states that are not as bad as those states, but still have some very unjust policies? Good example, suggested by the reading, what do you do about the US, specifically the South, in the era of the Jim Crow laws, right? The US wasn't as horrible as Nazi Germany, not as horrible as North Korea, but it did treat a large segment of its population very badly. So what can you do when a state that's somewhat just, but not totally just, has some policies that are unjust? Well, of course, in a democratic state like the US, the first thing maybe we would hope people would do is to try to change these policies through the ballot box, right? Go vote. Well, one of the reasons this isn't going to work in the Jim Crow South is, of course, African Americans weren't allowed to vote. So what do you do? If you are being denied your rights, or if you think there's some other great injustice in society, and there's no foreseeable way to really meet that injustice through democratic means. Well, civil disobedience is a response that many philosophers and other thinkers have recommended. And civil disobedience means that someone deliberately disobeys the law, usually the unjust law in question, but they can also disobey another law to draw attention to their cause, and they do that to try to bring about a change in public policy. In the case of the civil rights movement, sit-in protests, they would sit in segregated places and be arrested by the police, other sorts of actions like that. Okay, so what exactly is civil disobedience, and what sorts of conditions are attached to it? Well, civil disobedience, of course, isn't just any old law breaking. I can't just not pay my taxes and say that's civil disobedience. What is civil disobedience then? Well, the most common definition of civil disobedience is public, nonviolent breach of law that aims to bring about change in laws or government policies. So people who are civilly disobedient, they break the law, and their intention is to bring about some kind of change in government policies. Okay, so I think it will help if we talk about the conditions on civil disobedience. So we'll move on to that from this definition. So some of the conditions on civil disobedience are sort of baked into the definition. Public, nonviolent, but there are also a couple other conditions that people generally attach to civil disobedience. Those are that it's a last resort and that those involved accept the punishment. Okay, so let's go through each of these and see what they mean. And I think in Dr. King's letter, you can see a lot of how these play out. Okay, so public. Well, the idea here is that when it's really civil disobedience, the person doesn't do it in such a way that they're hidden, they don't just break the law, they make it public that they are breaking the law. Now, sometimes this can take two forms. Sometimes people who are civilly disobedient will go so far as to say, we're going to break the law in this way at this particular time, let the authorities know in advance. At other times, they won't do that, but they will do it in a very public way, knowing that they will be arrested, very likely. You know, the sit-ins at the lunch counters, for instance. Nonviolent, civil disobedience, the protesters are nonviolent, they don't fight back to the police. Even further than that, they don't aim to use violence against the public, they don't even use violence against property. Classic definition of civil disobedience, it's not just that, you know, they don't hurt other people, they don't destroy property either. Third, civil disobedience is a last resort. Now, as we'll see when we talk about just war theory, which also brings in this idea of a last resort, this is of course a kind of vague term. But the idea here is that if you are going to civil disobedience, you have tried to resolve the issue through other means. You can't just jump straight to breaking the law. You have to try to solve it through accepted means that don't involve law breaking. Try to solve it through normal politics, through elections, through that kind of thing first. Now, of course, that leaves open how long you have to try. When is it really a last resort? I think pretty clearly, you know, in the case of the civil rights movement, very good case, almost, I think, undeniable case, this is a last resort, right? By the time of the civil rights movement, it was almost 100 years since the end of the Civil War. African Americans in the South were still being denied their civil rights despite, you know, amendments to the Constitution, despite court rulings. Really not much progress at all had been made, right? So in that case, I feel it's pretty clear it was a last resort. Other cases, there's no real sort of neat mathematical formula that will tell you, oh, this is a last resort, oh, it's not. But if democratic politics, if ordinary means have not made any progress for a long time, and there doesn't seem any realistic prospect that they will, then I think people can legitimately invoke this last resort condition. Final condition on civil disobedience is that those involved accept the punishment. They break the law, but they don't try to avoid the punishment. In fact, they deliberately accept the punishment. You can see this from Dr. King's letter. He wrote this from jail, right? Now, this might strike you as a little odd. You know, they think the law is unjust. Nonetheless, they accept the punishment. But we'll see why this is in a second. Now, one of the things I'll let you guys know is at the end of the presentation, I might push back a little bit on this publicity condition and this those involved accept the punishment condition. I'm not sure that they're wrong, but I wonder if there might not be acceptable cases of civil disobedience that don't satisfy 1 or 4. I think 2 and 3 are much better. 1 and 4, I think there's a little bit of room for doubt. But we'll come back to this. I think before we see that, we have to see the rationale for all these conditions. So why these particular conditions on civil disobedience? Well, I think they mostly come back to these 2 reasons. Civil disobedience is intended as a form of communication, and civil disobedience shows respect for the law. So think back to Dr. King's letter, right? Think back to what he says about trying to open up a dialogue, right? Their aim in civil disobedience is to get the white citizens who have not acknowledged their rights, not acknowledged the injustice, to recognize them, to actually engage with a dialogue with them as other citizens. And I think this is important. You know, with this civil disobedience as a form of communication, you can see the rationale for the publicity condition, right? If you're trying to communicate with somebody, you make it public. I think you can also see why we have, or at least part of the reasons we have, the nonviolence condition. Look, if you're trying to communicate with somebody, you're not trying to force them to do something. If I'm communicating with you, if I'm trying to engage in a dialogue, that's a lot different than if I'm trying to twist your arm into something, than if I am just trying to scare you into doing what I want, right? Civil rights movement, other forms of civil disobedience, people aren't trying to scare the other citizens. They're not trying to force the government to do what they want. They're trying to get acknowledged and to get their cause acknowledged, right? It's communication, it's not coercion. It's not trying to get the other person to do something because they're afraid or because you make their life miserable. Now, of course, there might be some disruption in civil disobedience. There's going to be, but that's just an attempt to get the public at large to acknowledge one's claims. Now, one other feature of civil disobedience, at least in the sense that Dr. King thought of it, and in the sense that philosophers usually think of it, is it appeals to values that are pretty widely shared by the public at large. If you ask Southerners and other Americans in the 60s, you know, these American values, basic rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, equality before the law, so on and so forth, everybody would mouth those rights, though, right? The U.S. is committed to those. Well, they're not living up to them. What the civil rights movement is doing, what other people involved in civil disobedience are doing, is appealing to these widely shared values that they think the other people accept, right? Social and moral values, you're not trying to force some new value on the person, you're just trying to get them to live up to values that you think they accept, that you think we as a society accept. Okay, so a good part of this goes back to civil disobedience being intended as a form of communication. The other aspect of civil disobedience that explains these conditions is that civil disobedience is supposed to show respect for the law. Well, how does it do that? Well, think about this, right? It's not just, remember, you know, talked about, well, Socrates would say you can't universalize this maxim, break the law whenever you feel like it. Well, but the maxim, the principle of break the law when all other options have been exhausted, that you could maybe universalize. The nonviolence aspect also goes back to this respect for law, right? One of the things that we do is to give over to the state pretty much the monopoly of the use of force, right? The state can punish people, the state can use force when people don't do what they're supposed to, private citizens, except in really exceptional circumstances like self-defense, can't. So by not using violence, they're not taking away, they're not stepping into the state's role as the one who has pretty much the only license to use force in a society. Then there is the taking the punishment aspect of civil disobedience. Look, you respect the law, you break it, but you take whatever punishment the law hands out. And there's actually pretty good evidence that even Socrates, who thought he had a duty to obey the law, would be okay with civil disobedience with this condition that you take the punishment. I won't bore you guys with this, but there are occasions where Socrates disobeyed the laws of Athens. What he didn't do was try to avoid the punishment that he might face for disobeying those laws. So, again, here, think about universalizing this principle. I will disagree with the laws when they're a last resort, when it's a last resort, and I will take the punishment for disobeying the laws. Much easier to universalize that, much easier to accept that principle than I'll break the law whenever I feel like it. So I want to end with slightly challenging the publicity requirement and the taking the punishment requirement. Now, I'm not sure either of these are wrong. I mean, I wouldn't go that far, but I do think that they're less clearly right than the nonviolence requirement or the last resort requirement. Now look, it's very hard to justify violence in disobeying the law. I mean, not impossible probably, right? If the state's unjust enough, maybe violence would be justified, but it's way harder to justify. There has to be a lot more at stake, right? I mean, we as Americans probably wouldn't rule it out because, well, there would not be an independent America if we had not used violence and rebelled against the British, but it's way harder to justify violent breaking of the law or violent resistance to public authority than it is to justify civil disobedience. And the last resort condition, of course, it's hard to justify this idea, just break the law whenever you feel like it, so I feel like that's a good requirement too. But how about the publicity requirement and the taking the punishment requirement? Now the thing is, the publicity requirement would seem to absolutely rule out some other forms or some forms of civil disobedience. And I'll give you guys an example. During the Vietnam War, there's pretty good evidence that the government, the government officials leading the war came to the conclusion fairly early on, as early as the Johnson administration, that the war was probably not winnable. And there's even clear evidence that the rationales that public officials were using for the war, that we're helping a friend, that we're stopping communism, weren't really our reasons for being there, right? There are documents that say it's more that we don't want to lose face, that, we don't want to be responsible for some kind of debacle, we as in the sense of the people running the government. And so there were officials in the government who knew this. There were documents that said this, among them the so-called Pentagon Papers. And so what to do, right? If you were an official and you knew that the government is lying to the public, what could you do? Well, one of the people involved, Daniel Ellsberg, actually decided to leak these documents to the press. If you've ever heard of the so-called Pentagon Papers, those are the documents Ellsberg leaked to the press. There was a pretty good movie on this a couple years ago, The Post. It's got Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep. Anyway, Ellsberg took these documents, copied them, leaked them to the press, with the aim of changing American public policy, right? The Vietnam War has drug on and on and on for reasons that Ellsberg thinks are false, and he wants to have an effect on public policy. Well, Ellsberg did not satisfy the publicity requirement, right? I mean, if he had even tried to, if he had said, oh, hey, by the way, I'm going to break the law in this way, I'm going to copy these documents, and I'm going to release them to the New York Times and the Washington Post, well, he would not have gotten very far with trying to get those documents out, right? He had been arrested then and there. Now, Ellsberg did not try super hard to hide his own identity. It was pretty clear from the way he did this who had released the documents. He knew that they would very likely be able to trace it back to him, and they did. He was later acquitted, but the government's case had a lot of problems. But, you know, he did not satisfy the publicity condition in that he did not make it open who he was and what he was doing. And you might also look, you know, a more modern case, think of the Snowden case. You know, I won't say a lot about Snowden, at least not in the presentation. One of the discussion questions will ask about the Snowden case. So if you want to discuss Snowden, there it is. But think about it this way. Snowden leaked these files from the NSA to journalists. Well, now if he'd been open with his bosses about what he wanted to do, he would have never been able to do it, right? If he'd have said, oh, by the way, I'm going to take these files from the NSA, I'm going to fly to Hong Kong and give them to these journalists, well, he wouldn't have got on that flight, right? So in either of these cases, the publicity requirement would render that form of civil disobedience impossible. They wouldn't have been able to do it. And what about the taking the punishment requirement? Well, I mean, part of the taking the punishment requirement is to show respect for law. Another reason that Dr. King put this requirement in here, another reason that the civil rights movement, people involved took the punishment, was because they thought, rightly, that it would be very effective, right? These people who have not, well, they've broken laws, but immoral laws, are taking the punishment, unjustly being punished. They rightly thought that it would generate a lot of sympathy for the movement, that it would be very effective in winning the public to their side, and that it would be very effective in getting these laws changed. Well, but what about when taking the punishment would not be effective? Think about people like Snowden who leak to the public, right? Well, if those people are punished, if they go to jail for 50 years or whatever and they're confined in solitary confinement, it makes it much less likely that anyone will challenge the government in this way in the future. So you might say in his position or a position like it, well, if I want these laws changed or these policies changed, it's not going to be a terribly effective way to do it if I let the government set a precedent that will terrify anybody who's thinking of doing what I'm thinking of doing. So for both those reasons, that both of them might actually interfere with civil disobedience, I wonder about the publicity requirement and the taking the punishment requirement. And for the taking the punishment requirement, you might even push back. Why in the world, if I think a law is unjust, fundamentally so, why should I be punished for breaking that unjust law? Now, I'm not saying the publicity requirement or the taking the punishment requirement are false. I'm just saying I think there are more reasons to challenge these, more reasons to push back on these than there are for the other two requirements, the last resort and nonviolence requirements.